BSI presents The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards with Matthew Childs and Cindy Paragill. Today's episode is on standards and batteries.
Hello and welcome to The Standard Show. My name is Matthew Childs and the aim of this podcast is to bring you the stories behind the standards. Now, batteries, they play a pretty big role in our lives, don't they? Whether we're putting in a couple of double A's into our TV remote controls, or some size C's into a camping lamp, or the rechargeable kind through our smartphones, and increasingly through e-bikes and electric vehicles. But it's not just on the consumer side. Batteries are also important for providing critical backup systems for important parts of our infrastructure like in telecoms or in hospitals. And overall, we are demanding more and more and benefiting more and more from this stored energy. And this episode is my conversation with Thomas Verghese, Business Development Manager from a company called Enersys, about this stored energy. Enersys is a stored energy systems and technology provider for industrial applications. And Thomas is a standards maker too, developing standards for rechargeable or secondary batteries. I spoke to him about just some of the growth areas in the use of batteries, some of the challenges facing the battery industry, and of course, standards. Though being the Standard Show, we started our conversation, well, in the traditional way. Now on the Standard Show, Thomas, we love people's standards journeys. We like to find out how on earth they got involved in this crazy world of standards. So what's been your standards journey? How and when did it start for you, and where are you now?
So it started probably about 10 to 15 years ago. So, and that's effectively joining the TC21 committee for the UK, going to the BSI building in London. That particular committee basically looks after batteries. It has a number of people from various backgrounds, and I was asked to join in. My background is that I started with Enersys as a process engineer about 25 plus years ago for a factory that actually made batteries for the forklift truck industry. So then through that, I started to do more customer facing roles. I think the battery industry itself, you need a wide range of knowledge. So you need some chemistry knowledge to understand how a battery works, because ultimately it's a chemical system. You also need some physics or electronics knowledge to understand basically how a battery interfaces with basically other electronic systems. And then you also need to be able to explain how a battery works to your customer base. So from my initial slightly technical, nerdy background, I was let out in front of customers. And from there, because of the sort of application support, I was asked to join the BSI TC21 committee about 10 or 15 years ago. Now, I'm no longer on that committee, just through other changes internally, but I'm still involved in certainly a couple of the other standards, particularly on a European basis now.
Now, I want to ask you about the standards you're involved with, but how have you found, you've been a standards maker for the past 10 or 15 years. How have you found that experience?
So it's over the last 10 years, certainly, there have been some massive changes. I think historically, from batteries, it was always quite a conservative industry. A lot of the standards that we looked at and we currently look at, to be honest, were established for decades before, and we were just tweaking around the edges. Now, clearly, as batteries have become, quite frankly, more sexy over the last few years, the pace of change of standards has quickened remarkably. So now we see a lot more standards coming on, particularly based around the lithium side, but also on the industrial side, which is still more traditional. You're getting into more and different markets which perhaps didn't even exist 20 years ago.
So what standards are you involved in the development of right now?
So there's a couple really. So first of all, one is to do with the labelling of batteries and battery technologies. So this is labelling of the battery chemistry. and it's centered around the recycling chain. So clearly, recycling is critical, and it's becoming more and more important. And it's important when recycling batteries that the chemistries are effectively kept apart. Historically, 99% of lead acid batteries were recycled. They have a value, and that recycling chain worked really, really well in terms of getting old product, having a value, and then getting back into the marketplace once it's broken down into its constituent parts. With the advent of lithium technology, the problem there is that the lithium and the lead effectively don't mix, particularly at the point of recycling. So it's important that we look at methods to basically separate the recycling streams. And I think one of the standards we're looking at now is labeling. So effectively, you will be able to see much more clearly on your batteries exactly what the chemical composition is. The other area that I'm involved in is automotive standards. So that's put simply, that's car batteries, apart from anything else, and that's IEC 695. So historically, that governed how car starter batteries, and it was always very simple in terms of a battery used to effectively just start a car. Then about 10 or 15 years ago, a new standard was introduced that looked after car starter batteries in start-stop engines. So effectively, that was asking a little bit more of the car, of the battery rather, at that point. And now we're looking at the latest family of that standard, where the battery will actually back up the e-vehicle traction battery. So if you can think of an e-vehicle as being an electric vehicle that is driven by a large battery, effectively. So behind that, from a safety point of view, there needs to be another battery, which will effectively take over and ensure that if something goes wrong with your main source of power, the e-vehicle, the backup battery will look after the vehicle in the short time that it may take to, for example, drive to the side of the road and keep basic safety devices online. So we're looking at a standard there in terms of that sort of family.
Now, you said earlier, Thomas, that that batteries are becoming very sexy now. We have the development of batteries. Now, obviously, batteries are a key part of modern life, aren't they? We use them for all sorts of things. I mean, we come to rely on them, for powering many things in our lives. Charging the batteries in our smartphones, or dropping a couple of double A's into a TV remote control, or for starting cars. You just mentioned there, but I'm just interested to know, where are the big growth areas for the use of batteries now?
So batteries have been around for almost as long as we've used electricity, effectively. So it's always backed up the grid, backed up the telephone systems, backed up lighting in hospitals or schools or critical buildings. Where we're seeing changes now is in terms of the fundamental safety of the equipment that we use. So, for example, a big growth area of batteries about 20, 25 years ago was in the telecom industry. So as mobile phones came in, we got mobile phone masks. Every mobile phone mast has a set of batteries that support that mast in the event of the electricity grid shutting down in that area. So that's all fine and very good. But as we have become to become more reliant on our mobile phones, not just for speaking to people, but for governing safety devices, then at that stage, the expectation of the battery that supports the systems becomes much more important. So a typical example of this would be the recent fires in California, where they were relying on the mobile phone infrastructure to direct people around, to put out the fires, to basically in an emergency situation, to run all the systems. And it was realized that in those areas where they were having to switch the electricity off almost to stop fires starting, that they were relying on battery power, and the battery power, quite frankly, wasn't sufficient because it wasn't going over a long enough period of time. So I think one of the areas of growth will be increasing the time or the autonomy that batteries need to run certain systems for, because those systems are now critical rather than historically nice to have.
So from a consumer perspective, then where are the growth areas there?
So clearly, one of the most obvious ones is the electric vehicle market, and we're seeing more and more electric vehicles on the road now. So two new areas where batteries are going to become more important is, number one, as I said, not just in providing power to the electric vehicle, but also backing up that electric power within the vehicle, and that's the standard I'm working on. But secondly, also storage at charging points. So, for example, you might have your Tesla, you may need to recharge it, and there are certain advantages to attaching a battery to a recharging point, basically to ensure that the grid is balanced, so that when the charging point isn't being used, perhaps overnight or at quiet periods, a battery can be recharged, but also utilizing wind or solar technology to allow you to recharge your battery in your car by recharging a battery that's associated with the recharging point.
This is Cindy Parakill here, just taking the batteries out of Matthew's conversation with Thomas to give me the chance to remind you that here on The Standard Show, we really welcome your feedback. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, especially if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Find and follow us on Twitter at Standard Show and on Instagram at The Standard Show. And check out the show notes for all of the ways to get in touch. Right, the batteries can go back in again now.
So in terms of the industry then, the battery industry, what are the main challenges facing the industry and that you work in?
So I think there are two main challenges. One is clearly autonomy. Everybody wants more and more power out of their battery moving forward. And then the second one is the recycling stream. So effectively, as we move to a more lithium-based battery technology, I think there are certainly a lot of challenges around recycling of lithium batteries as compared to lead acid batteries. And it's important to ensure that all of the chemical technologies are accounted for. As I said, the recycling's done very well over the years, but now we have some new challenges coming along. Not so much today, but certainly in 5 or 10 years' time, as more and more lithium batteries A, come onto the market, but B, reach the end of their life.
And is that a challenge there, not only for the industry, but also for consumers in terms of that recycling or disposal of batteries?
Yes, and clearly, at the moment, lead acid batteries have a value at the end of life. So it becomes much there's an infrastructure there which allows you to collect and to recycle the batteries. With lithium batteries, there is a cost associated with the recycling as of today, and that's a whole different way of thinking about the recycling stream, if you like. And that puts the emphasis not just on consumers, but on the companies that are placing the batteries onto the market.
I just wonder, Thomas, how much standards, help address these particular challenges?
Standards will help us identify the products, to direct the products down the right way, and to ensure that if the products are used perhaps in a different way in terms of how they were used initially, so-called second life of batteries, it allows you then to control and to ensure that the product that is being used as a second life is quite frankly safe for use.
Just wondering, your particular industry, the relationship between standards and regulation here, in terms of the manufacturer and the use of batteries, how important is that relationship?
Yeah, it's very important, particularly as legislation is being brought in to encourage the use of batteries. So, for example, if clearly where legislation is being brought in to encourage the use of electric vehicles, And because of that, that legislation, if we're being pushed towards electric vehicles, that legislation is also required through the mechanism of standards to ensure that the batteries that might be used in these sort of electric vehicle type applications are reduce their own associated carbon footprint.
What you talked about there, Thomas, is in terms of European regulation. I just think, asking you, I'm just interested in the global perspective here, because obviously batteries are used around the world. So the challenges for organisations like yourselves and as standards makers to deal with those different regulatory systems around the world with regard to batteries.
I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of the standards, whether they be EN style standards, clearly IEC and the relationship between EN and IEC, and UL. So while there are differences between the main geographical standards bodies that are embedded into the standards, there's also a lot of overlap. And clearly the standards bodies need to talk to each other to at least understand where everybody's coming from, where you're developing particularly new standards for new industries.
So in terms of, what's next, where do batteries go next?
So I think one of the interesting things is the EU directive that's coming in that'll govern batteries moving forward. And I think people will see a big difference in their everyday lives in terms of how that governs battery use from point of supply to point of recycling. And again, trying to control the full life cycle of the product, from putting it onto the market to how it goes into the recycling stream, and this zero carbon economy, which batteries are going to be critical to.
Just in terms of your background, your professional background, it seems to me there's been a real acceleration in battery technology. How do you perceive it? In terms of, are we going leaps and bounds here in terms of the technology evolving?
I think, I think we're at a point where there is going to be a step change in terms of how we rely on batteries and the technology that we use. And it's an exciting point to be at, but it's also a little bit scary, because there will be a lot of challenges in the next 5 to 10 years, whereas historically we were using batteries that maybe had a 40-year life, and clearly at the end of those 40 years the people who built it possibly weren't alive, and whereas now the batteries that you'll see in 5 or 10 years time will be very different from the batteries that are put onto the market today.
So in terms of you were talking about electric vehicles, so the backup batteries, they're not going to be designed then for a 40, 50 year life necessarily? No.
They'll be designed for effectively the life of the vehicle.
That's an interesting thing. They're designed for a shorter lifespan.
So it's effectively to back up your electric vehicle. So when your main battery, your main traction battery that is pushing your truck or your car, when that reaches the end of life, then in theory you would probably look at replacing your backup battery at the same time, even though that backup battery, chances are, will have done nothing through its life, or possibly will have done nothing through its life, because its only job is to, in the event of something going wrong with your main battery, your backup battery will take over. Now, in theory, nothing should go wrong with your main battery. How often have you been driving and the engine stops, for example? But you need to consider this possibly very rare event, and what do you do about it?
I know it's a bit off piste here, but I just sort of popped into my head. Electric planes. Are you involved in any of that? I mean, the battery powered planes?
Yeah. So at the moment, no. We do hear about stuff. I suspect it'll come with drones and from the military sector first, before we actually fly to Ibiza on an electric plane.
You have been listening to an episode of The Standard Show with Matthew Childs and Cindy Powergill. Subscribe to us now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.